and I'm taping. And then I must just download in between because that's my iPad's going to get full. Okay, so let's just see what we have done here. Hello. Hi. So my computer was working just now, now it's not working. So I'll just, oh, there it was going again. I'll just switch it off. So we're still trying to get in. Okay. All right, so on the page that says mechanisms of evolution. All right, so we've been talking about at the bottom, wait. Let me just see what's on here again. We've been talking about fossil evidence, which we've now covered. So now we've also looked at microevolutionary changes, like mutations that accumulate from over many generations. That's microevolution. All right, and then we're going to look at, so what is macroevolution? How do you end up with new species? And that's what this new PowerPoint is about. So microevolution are all the genetic changes, the random genetic changes that accumulate from one generation to the next. It forms part of that gene pool, but eventually there's enough genetic changes, if there's enough microevolutionary random mutations, then it could lead to speciation if type and so on. If the population is separated. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what we're getting to. So how does all this separation occur, or how could it occur, etc. Now I'm getting on. I don't know why I went blank just now. That was so bizarre. It was fine. Then I went down. Okay, so that's on, that's coming on. All right, so on this page, right at the bottom of mechanisms of evolution, okay, the A3 page, it says there are transitional fossils, trends in evolution. What information allows us to say that an organism has become a new species? Okay, so common ancestor, another common ancestor, giving rise to new species because of macroevolutionary changes. Alright. What's today? 22nd, I think. Alright, so the transitional fossils, things like Tiktaalik, etc. What's the other one? Tiktaalik and not coelacanth, the Archaeopteryx and so on. They give us more evidence to say that species evolved into others and then there were splits and then we ended up with new species. Now everything, sorry, I'm going to just go into Google Classroom, please. Alright, so that's at the bottom of this big page. You've got the Archaeopteryx. There's many examples of transitional forms. We talked about E, that was D. If you look at the bottom, E, the movement from water to land, so that Tiktaalik. And the fact that gill slits, well now if you look at crocodiles, they've got lungs, so they still have gill slits, it become, I'm sure, part of their vocal cords as well, just like us, but they now have lungs. So that transitional move onto land. E, becoming tetrapods with using lobed fins. All right, then what else have we done here? F, development of novelties. We've looked at cladograms or phylogenetic trees. So what made species 2 different from 1? Maybe this one had cartilage. Maybe this one now has bones. So there was ossification of cartilage. Maybe this one ended up being able to fly like a bird, and this one ended up being like a crocodile and walks on land. Because crocs and birds are, they are related by a common ancestor. Okay. All right. Chuck me out, totally now. All right, let's get into Google Classroom. So that's D, E, and F. And then all the other little things, they are going to now fill in those little gaps that we're trying to see how macroevolution, how speciation can occur. All right? And that we haven't done this either. Okay. All right, so I'm just getting into Google Classroom. I think it's the quickest, and I can find the PowerPoint really quickly. I think I have the slowest computer now. Anyone look at Google Classroom? checked it. Man, kindly told me. I'm now getting ready for Friday. There's all those revision cycle tests that tests that I've posted. And you can see my lessons on here now. I was so glad when I found all those. When I found the links from Mr. Ruzmeza. What? This one. Right, so we're on number 2, and I think we got up to like 20 or something like that. Okay. Alright, so let's just quickly go through this again. I'm going to switch off the lights. Might be a bit dark. Alright, they're going to have to deal with it at home. Alright, so we talked all about Darwin and how he was, what's the word? He was exposed to other people's ideas and then they came up with that theory. I'm not going through all that again. Are we happy with all of that? There's variation, and he saw that, and what else? And then you just go watch the video, and that we know that the environment, whatever's happening in the environment, that's a selection pressure, like a drought, could cause species to evolve or to have more microevolutionary changes, like being able to cope with droughts and less water and less leaves on trees, and then the fittest survive and pass on those genes over many, many generations. And eventually, over hundreds or thousands actually, of years, you might get speciation occurring. Okay, so Darwin said there's more offspring that are produced, survival of the fittest. Some of them are not going to have genes that allow them to be better adapted to the environment. We call them the runts, don't we? You heard of runt? Little puppy that doesn't make it, and those are the ones that are going faster. Okay, dot. All right. Okay, so there's a struggle for existence. Small percentage survive, but those are the fittest ones, and they pass on their stronger genes to their offspring. And over many generations, you might end up with more individuals. Okay, this is not doing the normal PowerPoint thing because it's now. Okay, we'll just leave it. Is it okay if I just do this? All right. So we have more organisms over many generations that can survive better, etc. All right. So he said. He concluded that the unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce leads to gradual changes in the population as the traits which help the organism survive and reproduce accumulate over many generations, and those that inhibit survival, like not coping with drought or less water or being too slow, they lost because they don't reproduce and pass on their genes. Maybe they reproduce, but then those organisms are also not fit for survival. So he called it natural selection. Right, so now I'm going to, and I think we stopped somewhere here. Okay, so microevolution and macroevolution is variation which occurs at the species level. So microevolution, lots of little genetic changes, and then at the species level, right, so I think I read that one. And so here you might initially have green beetles and brown beetles, and then brown beetles move into a population. There's just variation, just like we have different hair color or whatever, different number of spots or shapes of spots, whatever. You might get brown beetles moving in, okay, and maybe those brown beetles arose because of mutation. Maybe there was crossing over, and brown and beetles became more common. Do you remember that? Genetic drift. Brown and beetles become more common. All right. Gene flow means that they're still able to mate with one another. So depending on what's happening at the time, there's gene flow. Brown could be more common. Green could be more common, depending on the environment. Okay? So, two ways that alleles are removed from a population. So what have they done here now? So they say, if initially, I don't like words in that now, I need to go to the top. This is not good. So initially there's a population of a certain color, then there's a random mutation, then over time that new colored individual becomes more common, maybe because it's not preyed upon. Okay? Right, this is much better. feel like I'm still learning, don't you? Your brain? It's really hard to get so easy. You know what we're going to struggle with next year? Well, maybe you guys already had a long class. Okay? I'm going to struggle so much. Come on, now why don't you let me? Are you happy with why it's not loading? Okay, if not, starting. Okay, so here, in the beginning, I don't know what this, how do I get this one? No, okay, what is it? This is different to PowerPoint. What I have here. Okay, so here you initiate more green beetles and eventually over time, maybe green beetles, maybe they're blending with the grass and people, hang on, no. Maybe they stand out more, that these are brown beetles on brown sand, but no, I'm right. If it's green grass, then the person's going to step on more green beetles, whatever. So then you end up with more brown beetles. Or there's lots of little stories you can make up. I know that there's some others coming up here now. So over here, in the first generation, there's a couple of individuals with a recessive trait. Then that recessive trait becomes more common, okay, or less common as it would. All right, so I'm not too happy with this diagram. No, okay, we'll put another one. I'll use another one. All right. Okay, so next slide. All right. So macroevolution is when one species evolves into another, like over here, or from 1 to 2 and then to a crop or to a flying bird or something. I don't know why I wrote fly there. It's a bird. Okay. So when that new species form, they are a population. They share the same traits from survival of the fittest. Those genes have been accumulated over many generations, and they breed amongst themselves. And they might become separated from the original population, maybe by breeding or reproductive behaviors. Maybe they don't even recognize each other anymore. Maybe the mating ritual, you know how birds dance and, maybe that changes. Maybe the bird call, the little tweets that they make, that's all part of their reproductive behavior. So we're getting to the stage where we're going to say that if there are enough microevolutionary changes, then eventually this population becomes separate to that one, and obviously there's many more mutations that are occurring, and eventually whatever this was, they no longer recognize each other, and there's lots of evolutionary changes that you end up with totally different species. Okay? And then they can't breed with each other. It's like horses. Horses breed with horses, and which is the one? It's horses crossed with donkeys. Hey, donkeys breed with donkeys. They are different species. There's been enough evolutionary change that they are different species. They are similar in some respects, but they can still hybridize. They can still produce offspring, but those offspring are not fertile. So we say that when a new species is formed, that the two groups that have been formed can no longer breed successfully. They cannot produce a hybrid, or they produce a hybrid which is no longer fertile. Okay. All right. So speciation leads to new distinct species, and they either reproductively isolated from one another, or they can even be isolated in terms of where they live. Okay. All right. So reproductive isolation. It's changes that occur. Now there's a lovely video that I've got, and it's about there's one about salamanders and there's another one. Okay. So you've got the original salamanders, and somewhere in Florida, or somewhere near Florida in America, there's like a mountain. Oh, let me draw this. There's a group of salamanders, all right, and they breed. But then there's a mountain range. Let me rather do it here. There's like a mountain range and a valley, and there's two groups, and they found that they're slowly moving. Their habitat is changing. They're slowly moving, but they are accumulating microevolutionary changes. that these ones over here have a certain color, and they find that the ones that are now moving as well, they're actually physically moving. These ones may be red, and those ones may be black. I can't remember the exact colors, and these ones were yellow with black spots or something. But now, when they look at those salamanders, where they then merge, where the populations merge, they're still breeding with one another. But they say over hundreds or thousands of years, eventually they might end up with so many differences, maybe how they interact with each other, their behavior, that then they might be two separate species. But at the moment they talk about it being evolution in action. They have accumulated changes, they actually look different to one another, but on the other end of the mountain range, they still breed and they produce hybrids and they're still fertile, so it's still one species. But you see that there's lots of microevolution. There hasn't been enough microevolution that they are totally separate species, distinct species, but maybe 1,000 years from now they are. But they're saying it's happening quite quickly, because normally we don't see speciation happening in a lifetime. All right, and that's what Darwin said, but we now know that we can see it sometime happening in a lifetime. Okay, so eventually those might become separate species, they might become reproductively isolated, they don't recognize each other, the coloration is too different, or maybe even their reproductive organs are too different. So the males would have a little penis that fits into, reptiles and birds and things have a cloaca. It's like a single hole. That's where everything comes out, poo, wee, eggs, sperm goes in, alles. Okay, so reptiles are, they're more primitive because we've got separate openings for everything. So eventually maybe the penis is too big to fit in the cloaca. I mean, I'm really being crass now, but that's how it is, that they don't even recognize each other. Even with groups of butterflies, maybe they can't mate because the ovipositor, butterflies and moths mate at the back end. Maybe they don't fit anymore for whatever reason, that there's been microevolutionary changes, and then they're reproductively isolated, but they also could be, now these guys, at the moment they are becoming geographically isolated. We're getting to the words of this now. But eventually, with more changes, they might become reproductively isolated as well. Okay, and that's what could cause speciation. Now, okay. Getting a bit excited here, so I know we're getting there now. All right. Now, we could have different types of reproductive isolation. So there's pre-zygotic, and it's nicely stated in your textbook. Pre-zygotic means that there's something that prevents fertilization. Maybe the sperm, for whatever reason, can't attach to the egg or something, okay, for whatever reason. There could be post-zygotic, so after the zygote is formed, the embryo, like the mule, is sterile, it can't breed itself, so that's post-zygotic, okay? And I must say, I don't often see those words when we look at past papers, but the ideas are there. So there was one question about, write something about reproductive isolation. I just can't remember the exact wording now. So pre-zygotic, sperm and egg, for whatever reason don't meet. Male penis too big to fit in cloaca, can't get there. Post-zygotic, that embryo, which becomes the hybrid, like the mule, it's sterile. Okay, so that's post-zygotic. All right. Pre-zygotic, so the anatomical mating structures aren't, they're not compatible anymore, or the gametes, like I said, are not compatible. Do you remember pollen grains only germinate on stigmas of flowers of the same species? Do you remember when you did flowers? If rose pollen lands on dandelion stigma, nothing's happening. The chemicals don't match. There's actually chemicals that are released. All right? Behavioral isolation. They don't recognize each other. Maybe those salamanders behave differently, and the lady says, oh, I don't know who this guy is. He's behaving odd. So I'm not going to mate with him. I mean, that's simply what it is. Okay? Post-zygotic, that's the hybrid. Okay, mules do survive, but maybe the hybrid doesn't survive. Hybrid inviability. It doesn't live very long. And also it can't produce offspring. It doesn't get to old age. Okay? So you could end up with reproductive isolation. They could be quite similar. They could be in the same habitat. And there's a nice example coming up now. But they're like, who are you? I don't know who you are. You're behaving differently to me. I don't want to mate with you. They could be in the same environment. And we're going to get to that word now. Okay. But there's other ones. Okay, reproductive isolation It could be that they're in the same environment at the same time but don't like each other, don't recognize each other, or it could be that their schedules don't overlap. In other words, this species of frog breeds in early summer and this one only breeds in late summer. They're not going to meet, they're not going to be reproductively ready. Okay, so that's another way of reproductive isolation happening. They could have been, it could have been the same species of frog, but over time they become reproductively isolated. They're in the same habitat, but because they breed slightly out of sync with one another, okay, so they are now on their way, well, they become different species. All right, so in plants, I'm sure when you did flowers, you learned about how the insect goes in and collects pollen by chance and it takes it to stigmas of other flowers of the same species. Okay, so there are ways in which flowers are adapted that they only allow certain pollinators in. Well, not allow, but they are structured that only certain pollinators can fit in. Bees can fit in there, but the hummingbird can't get all the way back with its beak, and the flowers are hanging down, so he can't give his beak up there. Here the flowers are horizontal, and you can get to the nectar at the back here, and some of the pollen will rub on his neck, on his head, and then he goes to the next flower. You did all of that, hey? All right. So it's all about getting food, a reward, nectar or pollen, because bees use pollen as well. They make bee bread, but by chance they're transferring pollen from one flower to another, hopefully on another plant, so that we've got cross-pollination. Do you remember that? Okay, am I going too fast? All right, how long is this? We're going to have to stop it just now. Okay. Elephants. So this is something that I didn't know. Okay, so these are forest elephants. These ones have been considered a subspecies of the African elephant, which is called Loxodonta africana. But now there's evidence to show that they're actually totally different species. They thought they were of the same, but variation. Now they know that they are totally different species. So you get the bush elephants, these ones, and the forest elephants. So now they even have different names. So they were one species, Loxodonta africana, but now they've seen that there's enough evidence that they are totally different species. There's been enough microevolutionary chain that they're now totally different species. Okay. So that's an African example. They like to give, you see this give examples from here. Right, these are the words. Okay. Sympatric and allopatric. Alright, sympatric and allopatric speciation. And it is on the other side of this A3 sheet. And I've got lines going down the middle. Alright, so how do species form? So in the middle there I've got questions. What causes speciation? Microevolutionary changes, lots of them. Separation, reproductive isolation, okay? What is the species, what is speciation, etc. And then you get these two types. So on the left I've got here geographical isolation, which is allopatric. Think of atlas or geographical, AL. That's how I remember it. So geographical isolation, if they're separated by a mountain or separated by what else? What other geographical barriers could there be to isolate populations of the same species for long enough that they could become new species? So I said mountains, or even valleys. There was a valley there as well. What else, guys? Seas, Galapagos Islands, away from the mainland, from South America. What else? Those finches became geographically isolated. Rivers even. Many years ago, my memory is fading, but I remember we went on a hike in up Table Mountain, and our guide said, because there's a sand road going through the mountain forest, there are little birds that live in the forest, and they won't even fly over the sand road. So they're becoming geographically isolated, and maybe over, 1,000 years, they could become totally different species. That maybe there are enough microevolutionary changes in those two groups, populations of birds, that when they do meet or are brought together, that they won't recognize each other. So not only are they geographically isolated, but they could become reproductively isolated as well. It's like, you're a different color. I don't know your song. They won't mate. Okay, I'm being silly, but that's what it is. Does it make sense? Okay, so that was a little story that I heard about. Alright, so allopatric speciation is geographical, or atlas, A. Alright, becoming separated by some kind of barrier. Sympatric, they can live in a similar environment, but how are they separated from each other? Not by land, they're separated by what? Reproductive behavior, or their mating parts don't match, or their sperm and egg can't fuse, or their bird song is different, or their coloration is too different. It's like, you're dressing different to me, I don't like you. Okay? Alright. Isn't that how we are? We tend to accumulate with people that we like. Okay, we're all one species, but we like people that dress like that, or, isn't that true? Okay, but we're still one species. Alright. So those are the fancy words. Allopatric, geographical, AL, or atlas. Sympatric, same environment, but they are reproductively isolated. Okay, so this could lead to speciation. Individuals in a population become physically isolated from the others by a barrier, and each group evolves genetically random mutations, by random mutations, so that they also become geographically isolated, just like my salamanders could become geographically isolated eventually. That's a lovely little show. If the barrier breaks down, then they could no longer interbreed. However, with my salamander story, there's a barrier there, but at the end of the mountain range, they still meet up and they can produce hybrids, so not yet speciation. Okay? Alright. So if they can no longer interbreed, then it is speciation. Allopatric, geographical, atlas. They are physically isolated populations, because remember, evolution doesn't occur in a species, in an individual. It's in a population, lots of organisms of the same species that have these microevolutionary changes that become more common over generations. Alright. Okay, so they could also become reproductively isolated, because of this barrier. Alright. If the barrier breaks down, the individuals can no longer interbreed. Like the finches, they now know that they are separate species because they no longer recognize each other. They feed on different food sources. They have different song and dance. They are different species. Okay, so you can call it geographic or geographical speciation. Okay, 28 minutes. We'll carry on a bit. So there's the original population, separated by a river, a whatever, a floodplain, a drought, whatever. It could be anything. Okay, sea, water, oceans, big rivers, mountains. Okay, it could be, an area that's dried up totally, and now these, a lake drying up, and now, do you get the idea there? Okay. All right, so eventually these populations are separated, and it depends what is in each population. So for whatever reason, this one had more green beetles. So here there was some variation. I think that's a different color. There is variation there, and those colors become more common. At the top here, there was mutations, and now you get green beetles as well, and they become more common. Maybe they're surviving better in a forest, which is green. Maybe these guys are in a desert, which is brown, and then they're surviving better. So if there were green ones, they would be selected against, because they don't blend in with the environment, or they preyed on. You can make up stories. Okay. So there's another one, turtles. Okay, so, this is cute. So forest habitat, turtle eats fallen fruit, bob's head. Okay? Then, over thousands of years, now there's this mountain range popping up, okay? Tectonic plate crashing together. So this is still a forest, this is a forest grassland mix, whatever, there's a diversification in habitat, and eventually you've got grassland and forest, just like I was trying to explain with the beetle more or less. And then eventually this population still eats fallen fruit and bobs its head, but these ones eat grass and they grunt, whatever. I mean, it's a silly example. Okay, but if they were brought together, they can't breed, so they also become reproductively isolated. Alright. So, there's been a lovely question in past papers where you've got, just trying to check, there's North America, and here's South America, and they were how did it happen in geography? So we know now that there's that Isthmus of Panama, you know that little piece of land? So if that wasn't there, and there were shrimps living in that water, and now there's that little piece of land, you know there by Mexico and that links North America and South America, that Isthmus of land has separated different, a shrimp population. So over time, there's been enough microevolutionary changes that they have become different species. All right. So on either side, on either side of the Isthmus of Panama, the little land bridge, it closed about 3 million years ago. Initially, North America and South America were not joined. Now they are. And these are these little shrimps, the snapping shrimps. And this scientist, I can't remember her name now, she's from the Smithsonian. She and her colleagues found that shrimp on one side of the isthmus appeared almost identical to those on the other side, so they were once of the same population. But when she put males and females together from different sides of that isthmus, when she tried to put them together, they snapped aggressively. Instead of courting, they had become separate species, just as theory predicts that they would. Okay, microevolution changes over time, leading to speciation. All right, and there's a similar, it's been in 2 papers, in fact. And then I even made one, a different one, and put in one of my prenups. All right, so there's that the Isthmus of Panama. There's Costa Rica and Colombia. And these shrimps are different. There's different species on this side to that side, but they were once one population. All right, can I just stop this?